So I guess I want to start by saying that I think a lot of people currently are realizing the problems going on in our society and globally, and it's really easy to feel small and helpless, and that we can't change anything. And there's also a lot of really intelligent people who have really good ideas about how to change the current situation. But before we can even talk about how to change those things, I feel like it's really important to understand the state of things, who we are, what is the situation, and how can that be represented equally across the globe for everybody. So the word I want to use is Zeitgeist, and the definition I found for it that works for me is the general cultural, intellectual, ethical, spiritual, or political climate within a nation or even specific groups, along with the general ambience, morals, sociocultural direction, and mood associated with an era. So it's a lot of categories to try and define or figure out. So we need to come up with gauges, which is something that we've worked on in the past couple of days, is coming up with gauges or tools to measure the zeitgeist of the planet now. In the future, it's not specific. It's a tool that can be applied to other planets if we ever find them. So
basically, we're talking like taking the pulse of the society.
Taking the pulse of the society, exactly. It's a great way to put it. So the first gauge that we'll talk about is the roles and duties gauge. And this gauge is to look at society and define which roles are present, how are they valued, how are people channeled into them, how are natures nurtured, how are the natures of the individuals nurtured, and how are they guided into their roles, and how do people progress and evolve through them. Then how are the stages of life valued, because youth, older generations, how are their knowledges, how are their experiences passed on, honored, and utilized. Talking time.
Ah! Battery. How I love wasting you.
Yeah.
So the second gauge we're looking at is the shared view gauge. So this is collecting as many different disparate opinions as we can, intentionally looking to have what on the surface seem like opposing opinions. Like we want to get as many different aspects, perspectives as possible, and sort of through polling that and just through talking with people and talking with people in different stations, positions, situations, figuring out what basic, common, shared views and perceptions are. For example, the perception could be oil is running out, and that could be from an oil executive who's thinking oil is running out. That's a potential danger for my business. It also means I can make a lot of money right now. It might be coming from an environmentalist who's saying oil is running out. We need to change what we're using. The way we've been using oil is destroying the planet. So not as important the judgments that are being put on that centrally held core belief, but what is that general foundation of knowledge which is shared regardless of political, religious, and cultural viewpoints, filters.
Right. I think that's important, a baseline, a foundation of knowledge that we can work off of. I think you wanted to take this gauge too.
Oh.
Hold on to the tie.
I'll keep the talking tie.
Keep the talking tie.
So the third gauge we're looking at is the industrial resource gauge. When we're talking about industrial resources, we're bringing it back to oil. We're talking about things like oil. We're talking about metals. We're talking about resources that are generally extracted and used in production. These are also generally resources that aren't replenished. They're not as much biological resources. And so in this gauge, we're looking at who controls these, how they're distributed, and how they're utilized. Pretty straightforward, pretty important.
Yeah.
Almost as important as the talking tie.
Oh, thank you. I almost forgot about this. So, yeah, this is like a sister gauge to that, or a brother gauge. The life-sustaining resource gauge, which we've talked about as soil, water. We've also talked about air and solar energy, light. But in specific, soil and water producing food for human consumption is a huge issue when trying to determine the zeitgeist. Who has access to it, who's controlling it, or how is it controlled, and how is it being distributed? The management of these basic resources is really fundamental to gauging the global situation. It's also very straightforward.
Right. I'm gonna
You have any concerns?
jump out of the order we got here and actually hand the talking tie right back to you, because I think talking about life-sustaining resources, talking about the environments, talking about air, talking about food, talking about the things that we're taking into our bodies leads directly to the next gauge, which is number 6 that we put down.
Wonderful. Yeah, this is a really interesting one. The child health and development gauge. How are mothers and children, especially through pregnancy and the first 3 years of the child's life, being cared for? What are their living situations? How are they what is the situation the mothers find themselves in? I think it's important to acknowledge that environment does not begin at birth. It's as soon as we have an environment, when we're an embryo in our mother's stomach, in the womb, that's our first environment. So we adapt to situations that are happening to our mother. And a really great example from Peter Joseph's Zeitgeist film series from Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who's a professor of neurological sciences at Stanford. He brings up this example of the Dutch hunger winter, which is basically the Nazis occupied Holland, and they diverted all the food to Germany for about 3 months. Everyone's starving. And if you were a second or third trimester fetus, your body learned something really interesting, and it changed how you developed as a child, and it affected you in later years. Turns out you'd be really he put it stingy with sugars and fats, and more likely to have high blood pressure, obesity, or metabolic syndrome. So it's a really clear example of how if mothers are not being cared for with the proper quality of water, of food, of basic life-sustaining resources, it can affect the health of the citizens within our society. So taking a look at the climate in which children are being born into.
And looking at that as, a pretty direct prediction of a lot of factors in the upcoming generation, because when we're talking about pregnant mothers, when we're talking about kids in their first 3 or 4 years, really we're talking about the shape of the world 20 years from now for the next 20 years. We're talking about the next generation moving up. So it's closest we can come probably to looking into our own future.
I agree with that. Absolutely. It's extremely important. So I don't know if you want to jump back to that, but it's really important.